In this session, let us try to understand how Hadoop works. The Hadoop framework comprises of the Hadoop distributed file system and the MapReduce framework. Let us try to understand how the data is managed and processed by the Hadoop framework. The Hadoop framework divides the data into smaller chunks and stores each part of the data on a separate node within the cluster. Let us say we have around 4 terabytes of data and a 4-node Hadoop cluster. The HDFS would divide this data into 4 parts of 1 terabyte each. By doing this, the time taken to store this data onto the disk is significantly reduced. The total time taken to store this entire data onto the disk is equal to storing one part of the data, as it will store all the parts of the data simultaneously on different machines. In order to provide high availability, what Hadoop does is it would replicate each part of the data onto other machines that are present within the cluster. The number of copies it will replicate depends on the replication factor. By default, the replication factor is set to 3. If we consider the default replication factor is set, then there will be 3 copies for each part of the data on 3 different machines. In order to reduce the bandwidth and latency time, it would store 2 copies of same part of the data on the nodes that are present within the same rack, and the last copy would be stored on a node that is present on a different rack. Let us say node 1 and node 2 are on rack 1 and node 3 and node 4 are on rack 2. Then the first 2 copies of part 1 will be stored on node 1 and node 2, and the third copy of part 1 will be stored either on node 3 or node 4. The similar process is followed for storing remaining parts of the data. Since this data is distributed across the cluster, the Hadoop distributed file system takes care of the networking required by these nodes in order to communicate. Another advantage of distributing this data across the cluster is that while processing this data, it reduces a lot of time, as this data can be processed simultaneously. This was a brief overview of how Hadoop works. We would be learning how the data is written or read from the Hadoop cluster in the later sessions.